All right, objective 5.02. It's the last objective of the study guides, the last objective of the blueprint for us to talk about. And quite frankly, this section, even though it falls underneath our technologies, our advanced acceleration technologies of the platforms, it really is a repetitive, some of it is kind of repetitive to the sections that we saw earlier today explaining the basics of how TCP works or how protocols like HTTP work at layer 7. So getting right into it, they want us to be able to describe the purpose of TCP optimization. Now, when we talk about TCP optimization, what we're really dealing with here as far as the platform is concerned is you needing to understand that the Big IP platform operates as an operating system as a full proxy architecture, and we've probably said that 100 times in this deck or in this video since we've started recording. But that gives us the ability to separate the TCP connections from the client side and the server side. We have a completely different TCP handshake between the client and the Big IP than the TCP handshake that's happening between the Big IP and the server on the back end that we choose to send the traffic to as it flows through the Big IP platform. So the cool part about that is that proxied architecture gives us the ability to optimize TCP. It gives us the ability to say on the client, between us and the client, maybe that's a slow WAN circuit. So I can put in things like LAN or WAN-based TCP settings that optimize TCP for a connection that's happening over the WAN, which may be slower. It maybe needs Nagel's algorithm turned on. It maybe needs higher buffers for buffering functions. Then I'm doing between the Big IP and the server, which is obviously probably inside the data center and LAN-based between the two. So I could maybe on that side of the client or server side of the connection use a TCP LAN-based optimized settings that turn things like Nagel's algorithm off and turn the buffers down because we don't need as much buffering happening on a LAN side connection. And that TCP optimization allows us to perform better than most of the of architectures that are not full proxy, right? And when most people think of proxy, they think of slow, because there's a second person or person in the middle that's handling both sides of the flow at the same time. But the beauty of it is that we're built and architected to be that way from the ground up, and then we can turn on these optimization functionalities in the middle. So that's really a rehash of maybe things we talked about today in the TCP section this morning. But now we're down into, at the platform level, it's a very important part of our architecture and how we work. Some of the other things here that they bring up in this section is things like in the flow of traffic for HTTP at layer 7, functions that we may do or help optimize, like HTTP keep alives, which we've already talked about today, caching and compression functions and pipelining. These things are also acceleration functions that come inherently for the platform and how we work. Since we've already talked about HTTP keep alives, I don't want to rebeat that horse to death. Maybe you can go back if you have questions and relook at section, I think it's 1.4, 1.04. But let's talk a little bit about caching and compression. So caching and compression on the Big IP platform is very unique to us and how we do it, in that every Big IP platform running LTM would have the function of doing RAM caching. So you can go in and turn on RAM caching at an LTM level, and RAM caching would actually only honor objects that are cacheable from the server. If the application says these objects on me are cacheable, and you have built a policy on the Big IP platform that says I need to cache these types of objects or these objects that are at this path, as long as the application on the server has said yes, those objects are cacheable objects, then the Big IP would put those objects in his cache for a client making requests in for that object could receive them out of his cache rather than asking the server for them. However, even though the Big IP may have said in its settings that you've set up as an administrator that I want to cache these types of objects, if the application says those are not cacheable objects, then the Big IP won't cache them because he'll honor what the server has said is cacheable. Now, if you were using Application Acceleration Manager, which we didn't cover today, it gets deeper on caching functions, right? It gets a lot more aggressive around caching. But these simple RAM caching functions happen in the basic functions of LTM on our Big IP platform without having to license the box, at an AAM level to do advanced caching. Compression is simple base compression within the Big IP platform, unless you get into the AAM functionalities. So at the TMOS level, we do support compression. We actually have onboard compute to help us with compression so we can do it better. It's built into the box. It's, like I said, it's very simple compression. It's gzip and deflate based. And it will only allow you to set a level. I want to set a level 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 of the level of compression I want to do on the objects I've determined that I want to type, a type of objects I want to compress, maybe like text. Of course, you wouldn't do compression against things like a JPEG because there's just no way to compress it any further. However, with things like text, I may want to compress data as it flies. And so, you know, the whole point in doing compression is that you don't want to just say, well, I can do compression, and this is mostly text data, so let's turn it up to level 9, and it'll make everything go faster. It actually won't. You could run into the fact that because of the time and the deltas of you having to take the packet off the wire as an operating system, take the text file and compress it to level of 9, and then put it back on the wire and transport, you're going to transport extremely fast because the size of the file is much, much smaller. However, the time it took you to compress, take the data off the wire and compress it, and then after the transport, the client has to take the data off the wire and decompress before he can actually read it. The delta of time you saved across the transport has to be greater than the time you added compressing and decompressing on either side of the flow. So compression is always a tricky thing to enable. But the good part is that the Big IP platform has it built into hardware for functionality when it comes to compression. And our last one here is pipelining. And we really didn't talk about pipelining earlier today. It's really a part of that function as well, HTTP-based function. And pipelining, most people don't talk about pipelining too much anymore. We still support this functionality. However, it's kind of gone the way of the dodo in some areas because it was all about bandwidth in the past. Round trip times are what really determined the fact that we would really need to do pipelining and have the effect that would benefit us from pipelining. So what is pipelining? When a client makes a request and he receives the answers, makes a request, receives the answers, that's kind of how the client-server function works. There's a round-trip time delay there that can cause, give me object 1. Okay, now I've got object 1. Give me object 2. Okay, now I've got object 2. Give me object 3. Now I've got object 3. I had to wait for every round trip to happen before I got the next object. So what pipelining did was he would say, give me object 1, 2, and 3. And then he would say, here's objects 1, 2, and 3. So there was no wait for the round trip times that would add, theoretically, latency to the overall load of a page or get of the content. And so those functions are still around so we can support pipelining in HTTP. However, because of the bandwidth functions that most ISPs or service providers are providing these days, round-trip times aren't nearly as critical as they used to be, but that doesn't mean that in some instances you wouldn't need them, so we still do support that. This does wrap up the last of the objectives for this exam. Hopefully everything goes well for you on the exam, and good luck. Thanks.